of today's omnibus editions from the week. Adrian Lester reads a biography of the leader of the slave revolt that led to Haiti's independence in the early 1800s.
Black Sparticus, The Epic Life of Toussaint Louverture by Sudhir Hazareesingh. In the 18th century, Saint Domingue, the French half of what is now Haiti, was a rich country of plantation owners and 500,000 slaves. Toussaint Louverture was born a slave, but eventually became the first black governor of the country and a superhero to generations. Episode 1. I was born a slave, but nature gave me the soul of a free man. This fleeting mention in an administrative report written in 1797 was one of the few recorded instances in which Toussaint Louverture alluded to his personal predicament as a slave. In one of his later pamphlets, Toussaint summed up the inhumanity of slavery in its systematic tendency to tear away the son from his mother, the brother from his sister, the father from his son. As a slave, he had no legal personality, could not marry without the permission of his master, was banned from carrying weapons, and could be physically punished by being chained and beaten with whips or rods. These atrocities were widely documented in late colonial Saint Domingue, and horrified even those who defended the institution of slavery. They included throwing slaves into furnaces, burying them alive, blowing up their bodies with gunpowder, and cutting off their limbs. Various forms of torture, including castration and genital mutilation, were also widely practiced. Bonded labor was viewed as mere property. So surnames were the name of a slave's plantation. So in his youth, he was simply Toussaint du Breda. From the mid-1750s, the slaves in Saint Domingue began to form brotherhoods in the plantations. They practiced voodoo spiritual rituals involving dance, song, possession, and divination, while marrons, runaway slaves, escaped in increasing numbers, retreating to the bush where they formed bands, or hiding in plain sight in towns and cities, spreading ideas about emancipation. Toussaint spent most of his teenage and early adult years as a gardien du bête on the Breda sugar plantation, where his parents worked as slaves. By the age of 12, he had apparently become the fastest runner, the most agile climber, and the best swimmer of all the young slave children of the surrounding estates. In his teens, he began to master the horse-riding techniques which would later earn him the accolade of Centaur of the Savannah. His favorite method was to attempt to tame the horses by mounting them when they were still wild. By the time he reached young adulthood, he had become one of the colony's most accomplished horsemen. Native Creoles such as Toussaint, born in Saint Domingue, constituted around 40% of the adult population in the colony by 1790. It has been suggested that Toussaint fully embraced the emerging Vodou religion. Voodoo was a cult which centered around the worship of spirits, known as Loa, who were believed to preside over different aspects of earthly existence and communicate with humans during religious rituals. The belief that Toussaint possessed supernatural qualities became, and remains to this day, an integral part of Haitian culture. The Catholic Church in northern Saint Domingue was controlled by the Jesuit order, and tradition has it that they taught Toussaint to read and write. A pivotal figure in Toussaint's extended family circle was Pierre Baptiste, an Aluda freeman. He adopted Toussaint as his surrogate son after Toussaint's father died, and gave him lessons in history, geography, and algebra. He also introduced Toussaint to his niece, Suzanne, a fellow slave on the Breda plantation. They eventually settled down sometime around 1782 and lived together as a couple, Suzanne becoming the mother of his two sons, Isaac and Saint-Jean, born in 1786 and 1791 respectively. Toussaint welcomed Suzanne's son, Placide, an offspring from an earlier marriage, into his family, and later sent him to study in France along with Isaac. Toussaint's family network was large, complex, and multi-layered. Towards the end of his life, he claimed to have fathered no fewer than 16 children. He had numerous white mistresses, such as the legendary Madame Fisson, a white woman of rare beauty whose husband became one of Toussaint's agents. Taken together with his devotion to his godparents, his generosity towards his stepson Placide, and his efforts to maintain close relations with his siblings, these wider ties highlight the value he attached to family bonds. He was, in this respect, entirely representative of prevailing social customs, and large patriarchal extended families have remained a prominent feature of social life in rural Haiti to this day. It was clear that Toussaint was no ordinary slave. His penetrating intelligence, immediately observed by those who came into contact with him, rapidly attracted the attention of the plantation hierarchy. He was recruited as coachman to Antoine François Bayon de Libertat, a white French colon settler, the manager of the Breda estate. Toussaint effectively became his right-hand man, with the power to act in his name and travel across the colony on business for him. Toussaint's position of responsibility perhaps explains the interview he gave in 1799 to a local correspondent of the French Moniteur Universel, in which he was able to paint this idyllic portrait of his early marital life with Suzanne. Not only did we live in such abundance that we were able to make savings, but we also had the pleasure of giving food to the black plantation workers whenever they fell short. On Sundays and holidays, my wife, myself, and my relatives would go to Mass, and once back home, after enjoying a pleasant meal, the family would spend the rest of the day together, ending with a prayer which we would all say together. Recent research in the French archives has established that Toussaint was formally emancipated by 1776, but his emancipated status did not fundamentally change his lifestyle. He lived in more comfortable accommodation than the plantation slaves, with windows, beds, and curtains, and enjoyed the use of a comparatively larger allotment. But he did not, at this time, accumulate a huge fortune or own large properties. And if Toussaint was now free, the rest of his family were not. The names of Suzanne, Placide, and Isaac appear on the same 1785 register. Toussaint also watched over his extended family. Many of his relatives were deployed in the estate house as cooks, valets, housekeepers, seamstresses, and washerwomen. The main language Toussaint spoke and used on a daily basis during the first 5 decades of his life was Creole. One who heard him speak noted how precise but also how vivid and colourful his expression was. In its combination of French, African, and indigenous motifs, and its capacity for ambiguity, irony, and wit, the language was a perfect reflection of the cultural forces which shaped Toussaint's personality and intellect. Toussaint could also read, write, and speak French fluently, and from 1797 onwards he read French newspapers. Throughout his life, Toussaint was a very private man who confided in no one, and went out of his way to conceal important information about himself, his movements, and his ultimate goals. He spread misinformation and rumours, often put false locations on his letters, and his most confidential messages were dictated in separate parts to different secretaries. The only authoritative painting of him, made during his lifetime, has been lost, and he was renowned for his almost magical capacity to appear in the most unexpected of settings and vanish without a trace. His remaining correspondence affords some tantalizing glimpses of his private self, his concern for the education of his children, his passion for horses and roses, his attachment to personal hygiene, and his famously Spartan eating habits. Responding to a request from him, a letter from his wife Suzanne in 1794 mentioned the dispatch of fresh clothes and towels and 4 loaves of bread. The slave uprising of 1791 was conceived and executed by the black slaves of Saint Domingue and their leaders, Georges Biassou and Jean-François Papillon. They were both coachmen and well known to Toussaint, making it extremely likely that he was involved in the planning and execution of the rebellion with them. As one of the few slaves who could read, Toussaint was in a favourable position to shape their strategy. In the early moments of the insurrection, Toussaint used his slave name, but as he established his authority as an insurgent military commander, he then became Monsieur Toussaint. In the course of 1793, the name Louverture emerged, soon accompanied by a flamboyant signature. What precisely lay behind the metaphor of the surname opening is still a matter of debate. Events in France in the aftermath of the 1789 revolution also acted as a catalyst, as the revolutionaries failed to apply the universal principles of liberty and equality to the black populations. This fortified Toussaint's belief that the rights of Saint Domingue's black citizens would be secured only if they themselves seized the political initiative. A few days after the rebellion began, the entire northern plain was ablaze, as the plantations which produced the colony's finest sugar were devastated. Although some individuals were spared or protected by their slaves, hundreds of white men, women, and children were put to death, and others taken prisoner. The uprising of 1791 was the first formal coming together of the Louverture coalition. Slaves and free blacks, African-born and Creole, house slaves and runaway slaves, slave drivers and plantation workers, warriors and clergymen, as a large majority of Catholic priests in the northern parishes of Saint Domingue supported the slave rebellion. By November, the ranks of the black insurgent army had risen to 80,000, nearly half the slave population in the northern area. By the end of 1791, they had secured control over most of the northern and eastern parts of Saint Domingue, right up to the border with the Spanish-controlled territory of Santo Domingo. As a revolutionary leader, Toussaint was later known for his ability to assess his position pragmatically and carry out tactical retreats when necessary. This too was in evidence in his early activities in the rebellion. In November and December 1791, when fears of the imminent arrival of military reinforcements from France were growing, Toussaint encouraged the leaders of the uprising, Jean-François and Biassou, to cease fire and begin negotiations with the governor and French commissioners who had just landed in the colony. Given Toussaint's ability to think in strategic terms, it was unlikely that he saw this ceasefire as an endgame. Rather, he would have viewed it as the start of a political sequence in which the rebellion gained legitimacy. As the conflict resumed in 1792, Jean-François, who called himself Great Admiral, even though he had no navy, and Biassou, self-styled Governor-General and Viceroy, divided up the territories still under rebel control. Toussaint used this period to consolidate his military position and train his own forces at a fortified camp. His growing authority is alluded to in one of Biassou's letters, which refers to him as Monsieur le Maréchal and depicts him doing the rounds in rebel-controlled areas, establishing order, peace, and tranquility. He was ably assisted in this task by his brothers, Paul and Jean-Pierre, and his nephew, Moïse, who became key members of his entourage. Impressed by his military valor, Biassou, who barely knew one end of a rifle from another, promoted Toussaint to the rank of general in December 1792. From this moment on, Toussaint appeared in Biassou's proclamations as Notre Général d'Armée. Toussaint's declarations during this period sought to convince his people that it was he who was the most ardent defender of their emancipation from slavery, rather than any other rebel leaders or the French Republicans. He also stressed repeatedly that freedom needed to be recognized as a universal principle. A few weeks later, in an appeal to the men of color who were still supporting the French, he returned to this theme, urging that there could be no liberty in Saint Domingue until all were free. He then added, "I was the first to favor a cause that I have always upheld," before concluding, "What we have begun, I will finish." By May 1794, the slave rebellion in Saint Domingue, now part of Haiti, has been successful, though the island technically still belongs to Republican France. Episode 2. The greatest challenge for Toussaint now was to transform his own bedraggled combatants, most of whom came from local marrons, escaped slaves, into an effective fighting force, as well as forging a sense of unity among Saint Domingue's black population. This was a military imperative, not least because the Spanish and British forces relied heavily on locally recruited mercenaries, most of whom were black. But it was also a political necessity to ensure that the revolutionary gains achieved by the slaves during the early 1790s were consolidated. Fraternity was a multi-layered concept in his mind. All the black people of Saint Domingue were potentially his brothers, but this brotherhood was not exclusive to one community, as it also included whites, people of colour, Republicans from France, and all the men and women across the Atlantic who were engaged in the just war against slavery. Learning that Marron, slaves, had launched an insurrection in Jamaica in 1795, he expressed the hope that our brothers in this region will achieve their goal. I wish it with all my heart. In order to inspire a fraternal esprit de corps among these different elements, Toussaint constantly preached the virtues of republican unity. Whenever tensions flared up, as they invariably did in the early years, whether between whites and non-whites, black and people of colour, or Creoles and Bosal, African-born people, the commander gathered his troops and subjected them to a lengthy lecture in which he did not mince his words. As I have already made clear to you, Toussaint told his officers sharply in early 1795 after they had failed to obey his exact instructions, a good soldier should appear cold from the outside and methodical, loyal and fiery in the inside. On one occasion, he informed the French governor, Etienne Lavaux, that he had given a vehement dressing down to his officers and soldiers during a troop review, and that a sense of unity was now beginning to emerge among them. As a commander, Toussaint was notable for his precise planning of every military operation. He led by example, galvanizing his men by his presence and his willingness to expose himself to mortal danger. He was the epitome of the charismatic military leader, a model of sobriety. He slept only a few hours every night, drank no alcohol, and his capacity for physical endurance was greater than even the hardiest of his men. His daily diet consisted of a modest plate of vegetables, served with a few pieces of chicken or salted beef, or, when meat was not available, eggs or cheese. He was constantly on the move, and rode so fast that he frequently left his own guards trailing a long way behind him. He was able to give his military forces the comforting impression that he was always nearby, a sense which was reinforced by his remarkable memory for places and names. He often had better topographic knowledge of specific sites than the scouts who had been sent there, and he could almost always call out his soldiers and officers by name, even if he had only met them fleetingly years earlier. These qualities gave him a quasi-mystical aura among his men, many of whom regarded their commander as a divinity. There was a widespread belief that his military decisions were dictated to him by his spirit protector. His authority rested, too, on his capacity to appeal to the supernatural beliefs of his men. For example, the red handkerchief he often wore around his head, the corners tied in delicate knots, was seen as a symbol for Ogun Fair, the voodoo spirit of war and anger, who led his followers into combat and kept them safe. The campaigns Toussaint fought demanded extraordinary feats of bravery, but also vast reserves of physical stamina. He had had dozens of horses killed under him and was seriously wounded in battle 17 times. The most visible and permanent trace of these injuries was the loss of most of his front teeth, which he suffered when a cannonball exploded near him. Hence the widely held but mistaken belief that the name Louverture referred to the opening in the front of his mouth. Toussaint's expectations of his officers were always high, and he would rebuke any commander who failed to abide by his specific injunctions, especially if, as was frequently the case, he had made a personal trip to the field to demonstrate what exactly needed to be done. When, in January 1795, the military chiefs of Petite Rivière did not properly execute his plan to cross the river Artibonite to retake British-held positions on the opposite bank, Toussaint exploded with fury. "I ordered you to carry out this maneuver 3 times, and you blatantly ignored my instructions. I told you to use 18 and 12-pounders and even visited the site and showed you exactly where these artillery pieces should be placed. Your attitude has been negligent and careless." The commander-in-chief did not always abide by his own injunction to be cold from the outside. The prohibition of pillage was Toussaint's cardinal principle of military virtue. His army's code of military practice stipulated that any officer or soldier who was caught pillaging would be court-martialed and, if found guilty, would be sentenced to death. As with cases of treason, execution was to take place immediately and on sight. He turned the prohibition of pillage into a lesson in morality. We fight not for our fortunes. We will have ample time to think about such matters once we have chased our enemies from our lands, from our homes. We fight for our freedom, which is the greatest of riches we can aspire to, and we have to preserve it for ourselves and for our children, for our brothers and our citizens. Always mindful of the example he was setting, Toussaint's merciful acts could verge on the theatrical. When 4 Frenchmen who had gone over to the British were recaptured by his troops in 1798, he ordered them to be brought to his church the following Sunday. They were not told of their fate and must have expected to be executed, as they were guilty of aggravated treason. However, just as the priest's homily was extolling the virtues of Christian forgiveness, Toussaint walked up to the pew where the prisoners were seated and announced to the assembled congregation that they were to be pardoned. Unlike Napoleon, Toussaint was not a man of martial disposition, even though he readily confessed to having a great passion for military music, especially pieces for trumpets and percussion instruments. His Christian faith taught him the virtue of compassion. He was especially horrified, as he put it, by warriors with a fondness for spilling blood. If he could find a non-violent way of achieving his objectives, he preferred to take it. He always delivered ultimatums to his adversaries before attacking them, inviting them to surrender and promising to show clemency if they laid down their weapons. In 1798, his Republican troops had grown into an imposing force of nearly 20,000 men. He forged a group of commanders who were able and determined and who faithfully executed his instructions, although, like every grand capitaine, he believed that his presence was the only effective guarantee of victory on the battlefield. The junior officers and rank-and-file troops idolized their commander-in-chief and chanted his name after every victorious military operation. They followed him wherever he led them, across plains, mountains, and rivers, through scorching heat and driving rain, typically surviving on the most meager of rations. And despite being a strict disciplinarian, Toussaint loved these men like a father. As he said, "They are my children." In return, they repeated his favorite expression, playfully imitated his nasal voice, and called him Papa Toussaint, or Vieil Toussaint, Old Man Toussaint. He had to use more diplomatic approaches to deal with situations of labor unrest in the plantations, which were sometimes inflamed by anti-French forces. This is where his skills as a peacemaker were most effective. Advising Governor Laveaux in early 1796 about how to handle a group of unfortunate brothers who had launched an insurrection in the Port-du-Pays region after suffering abusive treatment by local whites and people of color, Toussaint urged him to tread lightly. It was only by acting with the greatest prudence that they would be able to bring them back to the path of righteousness. In a lengthy report, Toussaint explained how he regained the trust of local cultivateurs by holding a series of meetings with them, promising that any arrears owed them would be paid, and asking them to come to him if they needed protection from unscrupulous plantation managers. He urged them to forget past conflicts and live like brothers and true French citizens. Julien Raymond, a leader who became a very close ally of Toussaint and observed many of his interventions in such situations, marveled at his remarkable rhetorical talents when addressing ordinary men and women, combining paternalism with just the right touch of sternness. On these occasions, his repertoire of homespun Creole sayings came in very handy too. Among his favorites was this warning against charting a hazardous path. Mon qui doit marcher pieds nus doit bien voir dans chemin, à aussi pas gagner piquant. People who have to walk barefoot must see their path well in order to avoid thorns. Toussaint went to extraordinary lengths to convince his black brethren of the sincerity of the French Republican cause. On one occasion in April 1796, he spent several hours with a militia leader named Noël Artaud, who was extremely suspicious and worked up against Toussaint because he had arrived at their meeting accompanied by too many whites. I was forced to ride up to him by myself to reassure him and prove to him that my intentions were sincere. The two men then settled by a riverbank and had an extensive conversation in which Toussaint put forward arguments about Republican and racial unity. He added that infighting between black people could only serve the interests of their common enemies. Toussaint also spoke at length to Artaud's officers. The deal was perhaps clinched when he sent 4 bottles of tafia for Artaud's dragoons. Toussaint would also cement his bond with black audiences with humorous asides about whites and people of colour, contrasting the steadfastness of the nouveau libre with the mercurial disposition of many gens de couleur. He would remark, "Show a person of colour a piece of ham, and you can get him to run around the colony for you." On the 1st of April 1796, the Republican governor Etienne Lavaux organised a grand ceremony in the capital's main square in honour of Toussaint Louverture, whom he had just elevated as his deputy. By this point, the Republicans had reclaimed the territories previously held by the Spanish and were actively challenging the British in the enclaves they controlled. But tensions had been mounting between Lavaux and some of his mixed heritage commanders, culminating in an attempted coup against him by a group of rebels. During this conspiracy, the governor had been accused of advancing black interests at the expense of the people of colour. He had been manhandled and dragged to jail, and the plotters had issued a proclamation calling for his replacement by the military commander of the northern region, General Jean Villatte, who was also mixed heritage. The coup had been foiled thanks to Villatte's equivocation, but also the providential intervention of black troops commanded by Toussaint, who had arrived to confront the rebels and force Lavaux's release. In the presence of the senior officers of the French colonial army and to the sound of cannons blasting from the nearby forts, Lavaux now saluted Toussaint as the saviour of legitimate authority, before hailing him as the Black Sparticus, the modern incarnation of the legendary gladiator who led his fellow slaves against the Roman Republic. This was the first time Toussaint was publicly likened to Spartacus. Nothing moves as swiftly as revolutionary time, but even he probably could not have imagined when Toussaint embraced the slave revolt in 1791 that 5 years later the governor of Saint Domingue would be comparing him to such an illustrious Thracian predecessor. By 1798, Toussaint is the official deputy governor of the French colony of Saint Domingue, in what is now Haiti, and in charge of the Republican Army, and a new chief administrator is about to arrive from the French Republic. Episode 3. One of the defining moments in the history of colonial Saint-Domingue was Toussaint's expulsion of the French Directory agent Gabriel de Hédouville in October 1798, barely 6 months after he had arrived to take up his post. This episode confirmed the steady consolidation of Toussaint's power. From then on, Toussaint seemed willing, openly, to challenge the authority of France. The Black Spartacus was becoming more assertive, and his horizons were beginning to broaden. Toussaint was under no illusions about Hédouville. He was well informed about the latest political developments in Paris. He knew that the French Directory had explicitly instructed Hédouville to clip his wings. Whatever doubts Hédouville harboured about the difficulties he faced in gaining Toussaint's confidence would have been reinforced by the Commander-in-Chief's physical elusiveness upon his arrival in Saint-Domingue. Although he wrote saying that he was longing to meet his new boss, Toussaint steered well clear. Days became weeks, and there was still no sign of him. As yet more weeks passed, Hédouville insisted, somewhat lamely, "Come to me as promptly as possible. The efficiency of our operations demands it, and nothing can equal my impatience to make your acquaintance." Toussaint responded that he would arrive within a week, but still he did not appear, and his excuses began to sound almost insultingly frivolous. One day it was the need to attend a lavish banquet given in his honour, and another, the river Artibonite was too swollen due to heavy rains to allow him, the colony's most accomplished horseman, to pass. When the two men finally met at the official Fête de Victoire celebration in Cap Français in June 1798, Toussaint was publicly effusive about Hédouville, pledging his absolute loyalty to him as the official agent of the French Republic. But an eyewitness noted that the speech was read out without any show of enthusiasm, and that the Commander-in-Chief's manner remained cold during the entire occasion. Not even the slightest smile lit up his face. Edouville had arrived with instructions to reduce the size of Saint Domingue's Republican army and ultimately to challenge Toussaint's authority as the head of the armed forces. Once he arrived and took the full measure of Toussaint's power, the French agent realized that it was not limited to the military sphere, but had spilled over into all sectors of the civil administration, including the entire system of local government. In an early report, soon after he arrived in the colony, Edouville said, "The assemblies in the countryside are made of men from the plantations who allow themselves to be completely directed by Toussaint. When I arrived, I found all the judicial, civil, and military powers in the hands of Toussaint, and he had also reduced the justices of the peace and municipalities to positions of complete insignificance." From the outset, Toussaint's strategy had been to co-opt various territorial groups and at the same time draw on existing social and political institutions, from church officials and members of the National Guard to municipal administrators, a very republican enterprise anchored in his belief in the natural goodness of man and the ideal of fraternity. But it was also a Creole republicanism, a unique combination of European, African, and indigenous elements. This melange was most lavishly expressed in local festive celebrations in his honor, which were colorful displays of collective enthusiasm, tributes to Toussaint's power, and proof of the new social order, appealing to all the citizens of Saint Domingue. The ceremonies often brought together civil and religious authorities, as when Toussaint entered the liberated Port Républicain for the first time in 1798. He was greeted on the outskirts of town by a huge crowd of finely attired men and women, led by the clergy carrying crosses, thuribles, and banners. He was invited to walk under a canopy carried by 4 of the town's most affluent white planters. He refused, stating that such an honor should be reserved only for a deity. After marching through a succession of triumphal arches which had been erected along his path into the town centre, Toussaint was met by the municipal authorities who solemnly welcomed him as the liberator of Saint Domingue, and handed him a medal bearing the inscription, "After God, it is him." Toussaint established his headquarters in an habitation in the nearby commune of Henry, leased to him by Madame Descaut, who came from one of the most powerful white families in the colony. This legendary site, renowned for its long alleys, fragrant rose gardens, and the splendor of its principal house, was Toussaint's favorite retreat, a secluded spot where he held secret meetings with both his own agents and with foreign emissaries, a center of military operations where officers from across Saint Domingue came to receive their instructions, and a base from which he managed the restoration of the colony's plantations. It was also a court, where he organized cultural evenings and social gatherings. Toussaint received visitors in his Grand Cercle, meetings by invitation, and Petit Cercle, public audiences, with politeness, grace, and dignity, be they administrators, colonists, captains of American and Danish ships, planters, or tradesmen. Here, those who had fallen on hard times, in particular former white émigrés, could tearfully plead their case directly with the commander-in-chief. One of his local visitors in the late 1790s described him as manly in form, with a countenance bold and striking, yet full of the most prepossessing suavity, terrible to an enemy, but inviting to the objects of his friendship or his love. His outfit was always the same for these occasions: a blue jacket with a large red cape falling over his shoulders, red cuffs with 8 rows of lace on the arms, and a pair of large gold epaulets thrown back, scarlet waistcoat and pantaloons with half boots, round hat with a red feather, and a national cockade. From 1796 onwards, Toussaint's position was strengthened when a string of his candidates obtained positions as surveyors, priests, medical officers, gendarmes, and justices of the peace. He constantly interceded with successive French agents and national authorities in Paris on behalf of his various protégés, where his own son Isaac and stepson Placide were studying. Toussaint had a number of chaplains who served on his staff, notably his confessors Antôme and Molière, who were also his counselors. Toussaint's religiosity was a combination of spiritual idealism and temporal self-interest, He was fully immersed in Vodou culture and mythology, and was widely believed to call upon the divination services of its priests, who acted as soothsayers, foretelling his future. His local speeches could deploy voodoo notions whenever necessary, both to make serious points, but also, on occasion, in jest. He often used to joke that he had picked up his nasal voice from a Hungan spell, which had prevented him from speaking through his mouth. He truly believed in the Christian virtues and frequently composed his own prayers, which he declaimed at the altar during Mass. He was sincere when he claimed that his political and military triumphs were guided by the Almighty. He also understood the healing potential of religion in a colony which had been ravaged by slavery and war, pragmatically appreciating the importance of Catholicism as a source of discipline and social order. He gave instructions that all battalion commanders should lead their troops in prayer twice a day, in the morning and in the evening, and that they should be taken to Mass on Sundays fully kitted out and in the best possible order. Asked why he insisted on taking his officers with him to church, he replied that he hoped that the prayers and religious hymns would teach them to love and adore God and also to fear him. He added, no doubt with a twinkle in his eye, and so that they might learn better to follow military discipline. One of Toussaint's proclamations illustrated both his intimate knowledge of local topography and the creative ways in which he sought to deal with ongoing criminality. Noting that a wave of thefts had been committed in the neighbourhoods of Petite Rivière and Saint-Michel, he observed that the thieves were accustomed to taking their booty on a particular road by Petite Rivière. He ordered that all citizens travelling on that particular causeway be required to carry valid passports, and that local farmers be given responsibility for ensuring that these travel documents were inspected by the nearest regional military authorities. Ever a stickler for detail, Toussaint entrusted the owners and managers of one particular plantation, the Habitation Marion, with this duty of public safety. He also specified that the travellers' passports had to include the precise description of all the animals in their possession. Toussaint sought to nurture a sense of public spiritedness among the citizenry through the provision of primary schools, a major feature of his Republican program for the social regeneration of Saint Domingue. He tried to ensure that each locality had a schoolmaster who could teach children to read and write. He consolidated a network of educational institutions, including a central training school for teachers at Cap Français, the capital, thanks to which thousands of young black children between the ages of 8 and 15 were given a state education. One of the issues which did much to poison the relationship between Hédouville and Toussaint was the negotiations for the British withdrawal from their final outposts in the colony. In 1798, the British government realised that its position in the colony was no longer sustainable and dispatched Brigadier General Maitland to end the conflict in a way which was not dishonourable. Maitland soon realised that Toussaint was his more important contact, and in late August, a secret convention was signed between Toussaint and Maitland, which set out a framework for peaceful coexistence between the British government and the revolutionary authorities in Saint Domingue. Maitland pledged that the British would not interfere either militarily or politically in the affairs of the colony, and Toussaint undertook not to export his revolution to neighbouring Jamaica, which the British governed. This was a personal diplomatic success for Toussaint and a humiliation for Hédouville. Now Toussaint waited for Hédouville to make a serious tactical mistake before escalating the conflict. The French agent presented him with a golden opportunity in October 1798 by ordering the disarmament of the 700-strong northern military garrison of Fort Liberté. Troops loyal to Toussaint quickly took back control of the garrison, and Toussaint seized the moment to launch a full-scale uprising against Hédouville. He coordinated protests through his military commanders and organized several thousand cultivateurs to march on Cap Français, where Hédouville and his officials were based. A French visitor described the horrifying scene at La Fossette, just on the outskirts of Cap. Imagine 10,000 blacks of all ages and sexes, almost naked, grouped around campfires, abandoning themselves without any inhibition to all their passions, obscene dances, contortions, screams. Well, there was clearly more than a whiff of voodoo in the air, and Edouville later reported that Toussaint's mobilized cultivateurs had cast a spell on him in a ritual which involved dancing around a bull's head. Vilified by the revolutionary citizens of Saint Domingue and blockaded for several days by Toussaint's forces, Edouville was literally driven out of the colony in late October 1798, along with his retinue of 1,800 civilian and military officials. Toussaint's defeat of Edouville initiated a gradual rapprochement between Saint-Domingue and Britain. In a glowing article about the agreement published in the London Gazette in December 1798, most remarkable was the description of Toussaint, who was praised as a Negro born to vindicate the claims of his species and to show that the character of man is independent of exterior colour. The fascination with Toussaint even spread to white Jamaican high society. Having spent an evening hearing about his exploits from the British representative in Saint-Domingue, the new governor's wife, Maria, wrote enthusiastically in her diary, "After dinner, had a great conversation about General Toussaint Louverture, which was particularly interesting. He must be a wonderful man, and I really do believe intended for very good purposes." In November 1799, Napoleon Bonaparte comes to power in France as first consul, and in Saint-Domingue, now part of Haiti, the former slave Toussaint Louverture has conquered the eastern side of the territory belonging to Spain and united the island. He is now in a powerful position. Episode 4. The victorious Toussaint sent Bonaparte a brisk message that the whole of Hispaniola was now under Republican rule, and in a longer letter written to the first consul on the same day, he allowed himself to show off, praising his soldiers for their gallantry and fortitude during the Santo Domingo campaign. As with all his important letters, this one would probably have had several drafts, which he would have scrutinized to ensure that every word conveyed his precise intent. At the height of his career in the late 1790s, he would send out dozens of letters every day and wear down his 5 secretaries. The delivery of his messages preoccupied him constantly, and he often wrote supplementary letters to establish whether and when the initial ones had reached their destinations. And, in at least one instance, he penned a third letter inquiring about the first 2. Over the coming weeks and months, Toussaint threw all his energy into Santo Domingo, where he decreed the abolition of slavery and introduced a series of sweeping reforms which touched all sectors of public and private activity. He created a corps of gendarmes in every commune, with the important stipulation that each should have a trumpeter, set up public schools, built new roads, and opened 6 ports to foreign trade, while at the same time lowering taxes and duties so as to attract outside investment. He also introduced horse-driven carriages to the territory, which were soon racing around Santo Domingo at Louverturian speed. In this torrent of proclamations, one of the most remarkable invited new settlers from Saint-Domingue to seize the opportunities offered by the territory. This was Toussaint displaying his wonderfully eclectic qualities, visionary lyricism, closeness to nature, and in this instance, a touch of colonial entrepreneurship. In his own journeys across Santo Domingo, Toussaint was struck by the conspicuous lack of development. There were only 22 sugar plantations, and no indigo or cotton in sight. Coffee and tobacco were grown only for local consumption. He issued a proclamation inviting the population to concentrate on producing commodity crops, specifically sugar, coffee, cotton, and cocoa. He suggested that farmers should move away from their traditional subsistence favorites, such as bananas, sweet potatoes, and yams. It was only by making this transition that they would escape from poverty. Hearing about the unsatisfactory arrangements for religious worship in the region, he promptly created 4 new parishes and laid down the precise number of priests who should officiate in each of them, the frequency of their presence, and the services they should offer. In early February 1801, as his edicts were starting to transform Santo Domingo, he invited municipal authorities to select representatives to serve on a central assembly, which would meet in mid-March. Its task would be to draft a set of laws, which were suited to our habits, our customs, our climate, our industry, while at the same time strengthening even further our ties to the French Republic. The document would be sent to the government in Paris for approval, after which it would become the law of the land. Toussaint was now embarking upon his boldest venture yet, a new constitution. Toussaint received the draft text from the Assembly in early May 1801. Ever the perfectionist, he worked on the document for another 2 months before he felt it was ready to be made public. He knew that he had to assume full executive authority, all the more so since the idea of appointing a European governor who combined all civilian and military functions was beginning to gain ground in Paris. Toussaint believed, of course, that he was the right person for the post, not least because he had effectively held it for the past few years. In early July, Toussaint finally gave notice of the constitutional ceremony. It was to be held on the 7th in Cap Français. Toussaint arrived at precisely 5:30, preceded by a procession of civil and military authorities. By now, a large crowd had gathered at the scene, which formed a circle around the official platform. Among the distinguished guests were the members of the Assembly and the new American ambassador, Tobias Lear. Toussaint's speech, his first as governor of the colony, expanded on the theme of liberty. He praised France and vowed to cultivate a relationship of fraternity and friendship with its people. However, the colony's freedom was no longer dependent on French political thinking or practice. Alluding to the article which abolished slavery on the colony, he observed that it was now Saint Domingue's own constitution which guaranteed the freedom of its citizens, irrespective of their age, condition, or colour. The document's primary purpose was to immortalize liberty in the colony. Toussaint was careful not to sound triumphant. This was not so much a victory speech as a call to all citizens to remain vigilant and mobilized to defend Saint Domingue's collective sovereignty. The message could not be clearer. Saint Domingue's integrity as a political community was inseparable from the defense of the revolution. This was underlined by the Constitution's penultimate article. Every citizen has a duty to serve the country which has given him life and nourishment, for the maintenance of liberty and the equal share of properties whenever the law demands their defense. The president of the Assembly, Bernard Bourgelat, then made a speech. Towards the end of it, just before he proceeded to read out the 77 articles of the Constitution, he announced that even though the original plan had been to submit the constitutional draft to the French government for approval, the absence of laws in Saint Domingue had created a situation of imminent peril for the colony. Given these circumstances, Toussaint had to be invited to put the constitution into immediate execution. Toussaint could not but respond positively to such an urgent request, all the more so since he had obviously scripted it. So the draft text received its formal blessing at the Cap Français ceremony, and Toussaint approved his own nomination as governor. The theatrical effect was slightly lost on the crowd as his self-endorsement was drowned out by the enthusiastic roar, mingled no doubt with relief, which greeted the end of Bourgelat's lengthy speech. There was an even more audacious argument thrown in to justify this legislative fiat. Such prompt and decisive action was needed, Bourgelat claimed, because the French government had failed to make its views about Saint Domingue known and been silent for too long. This too was a splendidly Louverturian sleight of hand. The French government was being castigated, in effect, for not responding promptly enough to a document it had yet to receive. Yet Toussaint was keen for it to remain a French colony. The ceremony was followed by a Te Deum in Cap's church, and the day ended with a glittering banquet in Government House, attended by 600 invitees. There were toasts to the governor, to the assembly members, to the French and American governments. As Toussaint looked around the tables, he would have seen that the colony's mostly white civil and military dignitaries were breaking bread with guests who were black men born into slavery or came from slave families. And yet they could now, thanks to the constitution he had so artfully conjured, enjoy the rights of equal citizenship in Saint Domingue. Toussaint's major priority now was to defend the colony against a possible foreign attack. For the next few months, he travelled across the coastal areas, inspecting the fortifications of the main towns, ordering that additional cannon be brought to particular locations. He completed these preparations by ordering that his army be kitted out in brand new uniforms. He reassured them there would be no fighting in foreign lands, but only for the defence of our territories. In the late 1790s, many plantations were still in disarray. In 1800, he imposed martial order on agricultural production. Workers were not allowed to leave their plantations without permission. This fierce regime brought back echoes of slavery, and labourers reacted by leaving their plantations in droves. Yet the effect of his regulations was immediate. Sugar and coffee production rose by a third within 2 years, and a year later, cotton exports were up to 60% of the pre-revolution levels. In economic terms, his system proved remarkably efficient. But the fault lines in Toussaint's power, the doubts about his excessive concentration of executive authority, his self-reliance and reluctance to share his plans with his subordinates, the resentment among the plantation workers, and the widening contrast between the moral values he promoted and the material aspirations of his soldiers came to a head in a series of rebellions. These broke out during the latter half of October 1801 across the colony, led by his nephew Moïse. The rebels were defeated, but gone now were the days when Toussaint was more forgiving of sins committed by black people. The restoration of order across the northern region was carried out with extreme brutality. Dozens of cultivateurs were summarily executed, some merely for hailing from a locality which had been held by rebel commanders. Toussaint staged a gruesome scene in Cap in early November 1801, assembling the population for the execution of 40 rebels who were chained to each other. Toussaint harangued the crowd menacingly and announced the impending execution of Moïse. 3 cannons were then lined up against the prisoners, who were blown to pieces. The crowd dispersed in terror. Toussaint's full response to the Moïse rebellion came in the decree of 4th Frimaire, 25th of November, 1801, 4 days after the execution of his nephew. It was an extraordinary document in all senses of the term, in the sheer range of issues it addressed, in its often hectoring and accusatory tone, and in the scale of the repressive measures it proposed. The decree ended with a raft of measures which showed a Louverturian characteristic mixture of efficiency, fierceness, and eccentricity, ranging from the imperative duty of military commanders to combat sedition to the issuing of security cards to all citizens, renewable every 6 months. Any Creole native of the colony found guilty of the crime would be sentenced to 6 months of hard labour with a chain on the foot, while a foreigner would be deported. This was the first time Toussaint distinguished the colony's population along these lines. He spared no one. He first attacked negligent parents, especially in towns, who indulged their children to grow up in idleness and without any proper understanding of their duties to society. He noted that these young people were allowed to wear jewellery and earrings from a very tender age and acquired a taste for idleness and luxury. He also chastised young women who ended up in prostitution, domestic servants who needed to be watched so that they did not steal or fall into idleness, a major vice in Toussaint's eyes, public servants and military commanders who did not respect their vows of marriage and had several concubines in their homes, and a great number of plantation workers who allowed their children to lead lives of dissipation in towns and whose laziness was potentially a menace to society. Drawing again on his ideal of the common good, he asserted forcefully that this class of men must be compelled, even against its will, to play a socially useful role. Amidst these repressive measures, Toussaint had not abandoned his ambition to safeguard the marital bliss of Saint Domingue's couples. Not content with requiring his soldiers and plantation workers to obtain his personal permission before getting married, he now threatened grave sanctions against anyone who was known to have disrupted or attempted to disrupt a marriage. Unremittingly on the warpath, the moral crusader warned all the colony's seducers they would be personally answerable to the governor. After overcoming the Moïse rebellion and reasserting his authority across the territory through a vigorous show of force, Toussaint no doubt hoped that he had earned himself a breathing space. But the respite proved short-lived. In July 1801, the former slave Toussaint Louverture, commander of the Republican Army, has drawn up a constitution for Saint Domingue in what is now Haiti and appointed himself governor of the island, where slavery has been abolished. But now Napoleon Bonaparte is in power in France and has designs on the island. Episode 5. The diplomatic landscape in Europe was shifting. And in early October 1801, France and Britain signed preliminaries which paved the way for peace between the hitherto uncompromising rivals. Toussaint immediately understood the potentially disastrous implications of such a Franco-British truce, were it to be confirmed, for Saint Domingue. It would end the British naval blockade of the Atlantic and open the way for a French military expedition to overthrow his regime. By the time news of the agreement reached Saint Domingue, in early December, the colony was rife with rumours of an impending French invasion. Toussaint decided to issue a proclamation to prepare his people for the French attack. Printed on a large white poster and distributed across the colony, his address began by casting doubt on the rumour that French troops were on their way to destroy the colony and the freedoms it enjoyed. Such a story could only be spread by malicious forces. Having confirmed the rumour by denying it, he then added that Bonaparte had rounded up all the blacks and persons of colour living in France who were opposed to him and was sending them to fight against their own compatriots, that the French government was holding his own 2 children as hostages and was refusing to release them despite their father's repeated demands for their return, and that the purpose of the invasion was to eliminate the soldiers and officers of the colonial army and bring them back into slavery. It was inconceivable, by which he meant extraordinary, that France should come to attack Saint Domingue after its revolutionary citizens had selflessly given their lives to safeguard French interests against her internal and external enemies, and turned a chaotic colony into a flourishing enterprise. Toussaint had timed his proclamation well. 6 days before its publication, a large French military fleet had sailed from France heading for Saint Domingue. Aboard were Isaac and Placide, the 2 children for whose safe return he had been long praying. The long-awaited missive from Napoleon Bonaparte was on its way too, but its emollient contents were no more than a sinister ruse. The French objective was to reoccupy the colony, restore white supremacy, and eliminate the governor and the entire ruling group which had emerged under his leadership. Toussaint's moment of reckoning had arrived. Toussaint wrote Napoleon a number of letters from 1800 onwards, all of which went unanswered. Meanwhile, the Bonapartes were in Toussaint's debt. Josephine's Martinique-based family had considerable financial interests in Saint-Domingue, notably a number of lucrative sugar plantations in Léogâne. Production had ground to a halt during the early revolutionary years, but hearing about Toussaint's restoration of order in the colony, Josephine wrote directly to him in 1798, pleading for his help. Bonaparte was away on his Egyptian campaign at the time. Toussaint immediately intervened to restore the plantations to working order, and soon Josephine was again receiving a healthy income from her Saint-Domingue estates. She was so grateful that she invited Toussaint's sons several times to lunch and dinner at her Parisian residences and praised the general effusively. When Bonaparte later met Toussaint's children, he told them that their father was a great man who had rendered eminent services to France. In the early months of 1801, the first consul seemed to have made up his mind to throw his weight behind Toussaint. He drafted a letter appointing him as Capitaine Général of the French part of the colony and assuring him that he enjoyed the greatest trust of the government in Paris. But the letter was never sent, and Bonaparte rapidly turned against Toussaint. If there was a single event which undoubtedly provoked Bonaparte's anger, it was Toussaint's takeover of the Spanish territory of Santo Domingo, of which he informed the French government in mid-February 1801. The first consul saw this as an act of insubordination, and by early October 1801, Bonaparte fully turned against Toussaint, ordering a major expeditionary force bound for Saint-Domingue. Later, at Sant'Olina, while acknowledging his mistake in ordering the invasion, Napoleon blamed the Council of State, Josephine, and the shrieks of the colonial lobby for poisoning his relations with Toussaint's regime. But in truth, the primary responsibility lay squarely with him. On the 29th of January, 1802, the lead ships of the French fleet were sighted at Cape Samana on the northeastern corner of the territory. Toussaint was visiting Santo Domingo at the time as part of his reinforcement of coastal defences. He immediately rode to inspect the scene with his guard. He saw at least 25 French naval vessels already anchored, including 10 ships of the line, the biggest carriers of the time. Each could ferry 1,000 men. And as he gazed at the horizon, he could discern the silhouettes of dozens more warships heading for Saint Domingue. He immediately realized the scale of the operation which Bonaparte had mounted. Toussaint's final and most momentous struggle had begun. With his battalions dispersed across the territory, Toussaint sent instructions to his lieutenants to prevent the French from disembarking and gaining access to the principal coastal towns, if necessary by fighting back. If their situation became untenable, they were to retreat inland after setting their positions alight. The main prize for the invaders was Cap Français, the capital, and Toussaint raced there, arriving well before the enemy fleet. He first masterminded a diversion, which took the invading ships to Port Margot, a landing point much further west. According to a number of witnesses, he then slipped into the city disguised as a Congo peasant. After evacuating the inhabitants, boiling oil, sugar, and heated barrels of rum were poured onto the streets, and buildings were set alight, and the blaze soon caused the explosion of the arsenal. More than 90% of the city was destroyed, including the granary, a devastating blow to the invaders, even before they had set foot in Saint Domingue. The first consul had written a letter directly to Toussaint, in which he sought to rally him. While it chided him for some aspects of his 1801 constitution which were contrary to the dignity and sovereignty of the French people, it assured him of Bonaparte's unreserved esteem and promised him consideration, honours, and fortune. The letter was dispatched with Toussaint's 2 children, who duly made their way to Henri, where they were reunited with their mother and father who had not seen them for 6 years. Even though he was moved beyond words to see his offspring, Toussaint immediately saw through Bonaparte's ruse and put the letter aside before he had finished reading it. He told his children and their tutor that if the first consul truly wanted peace, he would not have sent a fleet of warships to Saint Domingue. Toussaint was correct about Bonaparte's hostile intentions. In his secret instructions for the Saint Domingue expedition, written in late October 1801, the first consul had meticulously spelled out his plans for the restoration of French authority in the colony, which specifically included measures to eliminate the governor and restore slavery in the Caribbean. This planned restoration of slavery in the region a year after its abolition by Toussaint was a striking illustration of the incoherence of Bonaparte's thinking. The idea that reintroducing slavery in one French territory would not have any effects on neighbouring ones was utterly delusional. The spring campaign of 1802, which lasted 72 days, was Toussaint's last stand, and his greatest. He drew upon his wealth of military knowledge and experience, combining the resources of conventional warfare with the techniques of guerrilla combat and pushing himself and his men to their physical limits. Constantly on the move and sleeping on a plank for a few hours every night, he sent the French on long and exhausting marches to chase him across the mountains, but remained out of reach, despite their frequent and increasingly desperate efforts to track him down. Toussaint's charisma was evident as he galvanized his troops. Perhaps the most remarkable moment came when he realized that the French force contained troops from his own 9th Regiment, who had just defected to the French side. Walking up boldly to the men, he asked them if they were prepared to kill their father and their own brothers. Even though one officer fired at him, most of the regiment lowered their weapons at the sight of their former commander, and many fell on their knees and begged Toussaint for forgiveness. In the last week of March 1801, Toussaint began to sound out the French about the possibility of a truce. He was neither bowed nor defeated, but he knew that he did not have the necessary military resources to defeat the French at this point. The commander of the expeditionary force, Victoire Emmanuel Leclerc, was only too happy to hear such sentiments. The two men met at Cap Français in early May and reached an agreement on the immediate cessation of hostilities. Toussaint was greeted with military honours and demanded something he knew Leclerc would not accept: his appointment as Lieutenant General of the colony, so that he could achieve what he actually wanted: the amnesty and integration of all his officers and soldiers into the French army. On the 7th of May, Leclerc hosted a lavish reconciliation lunch, attended by senior officers from both sides. Still wary of the French, Toussaint only ate a slice of Gruyère, but he had lost none of his impertinence. When Leclerc asked him where he would have found the weapons and ammunition to keep fighting, had he chosen to continue the war, he replied smoothly, "I would have taken them from your stores." With only a symbolic retinue of soldiers, Toussaint then departed for one of his estates in Henry. As he spent time on the 4 coffee plantations he owned in the area, he began to glimpse the quiet life he had often yearned for, surrounded by his family. On the 7th of June, 1802, the French sprang a trap for Toussaint, inviting him to a meeting at the Georges plantation with one of their local commanders. An hour after Toussaint entered the house, he was arrested and put on a ship. His servant, wife, niece, and sons were also detained, and French troops went on a looting rampage at his property at Henry, stealing money, clothing, furniture, and works of art, under the pretense of looking for Toussaint's papers. Why a man who had avoided dozens of ambushes allowed himself to be captured so easily is a good question. At his previous meeting with Leclerc, he had arrived with 300 soldiers. This time, he went with 1 aide-de-camp and a single domestic servant. He reached Brest on the 9th of July. It was his first time on a ship. He was allowed no contact with the members of his family who were on board, and indeed was never to see them again. The medieval fortress in which he was imprisoned was deep in eastern France, in the Jura Mountains, the austere location deliberately chosen for its cold weather and its remoteness from the sea. Leclerc was terrified that he might escape and return to Saint Domingue. By September 1802, Toussaint was under no illusion that he would ever leave Fort de Joux alive. As the winter of 1802-1803 set in, his health deteriorated rapidly. He lost weight, began to suffer from a chronic cough, and complained of constant headaches and stomach pains. He was given little medical assistance, and on the 7th of April, 1803, the prison governor found him dead in his cell, slumped by the fireside. His body was buried in the fort chapel. Toussaint Louverture was the first black superhero of the modern age. He decisively shaped the course of the Haitian War of Independence and became a hero for generations of men and women fighting for freedom from slavery and imperial oppression. By the time the French landed, the people of Saint Domingue understood that their freedom was not a quality bestowed on them by a benevolent authority, but a right which they had seized through struggle. As he boarded the ship for France, he made the point to his captors, "By striking me you have cut the tree of black liberty in Saint Domingue, but it will spring back up from its roots, for they are many and deep."